Hey there, sword friends, I just want to show you this latest sword I just acquired from the legendary sword maker Angus Trim this past weekend. Many of you wouldn't be unfamiliar with Angus Trim's swords. He has been an active player in the industry since the late 80s. So, decades of experience, experimentation, historical sword making. His work has been held in high regards by particularly the historical European martial art competition cutting crowd, often taken to sword cutting competitions in various HEMA events and have been used to win laurels. I personally own 4 pieces at this time and reviewed a few others loaned to me. Now I talked to Gus last winter to express my interest in acquiring a Type XIIIb sword to complete my oak shot collection, essentially high quality representation of every subtype of the oak shot typology. And Type XIIIb is the last one on my list that pretty much completes that series of collection. And I'm going to do a 2-part video. One is the evolution of medieval longsword. The other one is the evolution of medieval arming sword. They will be released this summer, so stay tuned. Now this past weekend, I drove to south of the border to meet up with my pal Vic and Jon. They are joining us as co-hosts at Unsheath's Sword Review today.
Welcome everybody to Unsheath's Sword Reviews. I'm John.
I'm Vic.
And I'm Kane.
And once again, we have special guest Kane Shen with us here today. And we are here to do a first impression and sort of just conversation about some swords from this guy you may have heard of, a friend of the show, G Trizzle, aka Angus Trim. And Kane, why don't you tell us a little bit about this sword and the process of how you picked it?
I just had a very productive weekend with these two, and we're gonna have so much fun with this sword that I just picked up from Angus Trim himself, from his secret back cave.
We went to the back cave.
Right, and aka the Disneyland for adults.
For sword nerds, for sure.
Thank you, Vic and Jon, and your ladies, Deborah and Kiana, for being such gracious hosts. We had so much fun this past weekend, recording tons of collaborative reviews, but also cutting up a mountain of bottles. But the main course on our menu had always been the visit to Angus Trim, especially in his secret back cave of sword making. To the outsiders, it might merely be a regular workshop and warehouse, but there has been an analogy thrown out before. It's like kids going to a candy shop and you just want to try every flavor when Gus lays out all these swords of great variety, of all the different types, but with very good diversity even within each subtype, dozens of different designs. However, I think a more adequate analogy is like going to Disneyland for sword nerds. Gus Trim swords has been one of the golden standards in historical European martial art community in terms of performance cutting. When I got to pick up this Type XIIIb sword that I described earlier to Gus for some of my personal tastes in terms of the subtype characterization, it was really a jolting experience. The sword pretty much carries all the characteristics that typifies the oak shot Type XIIIb. If you look at the blade, it's of a medium length, around 30 inches, 75 centimeters in length. It has a single-handed grip, and it has this just gorgeous silhouette. Remains very broad throughout. Now, the oak shot Type XIIIb blades came around in late 13th and early 14th century. Basically, it's a continuation of earlier medieval swords. If you look at this Type X arming sword from the 11th century, and then this XIIIb sword from 2 centuries later, you can see a continuous trend in the evolution of medieval arming swords, which we will discuss in depth in my evolution of the medieval arming sword video. This sword feels very broad on its own. However, if we compare it to the Type X sword, you can see the base isn't as broad. Nevertheless, if you go up the blade and look at the upper portion, the width are very comparable on two swords. And this is pretty much the defining trait of the Type XIIIb sword. They have so little profile taper in the width of the blade, resulting in a very broad blade throughout to maintaining this very wide but thin blade for maximum cutting potential. Essentially, this is like a big razor on a handle for single-handed usage. You think that it has to weigh a ton being this wide, right? But this one here weighs merely 2 pounds and 2 ounces. And you can extend your wrist out like this pretty much the whole time without feeling any fatigue. Just look at how easy it is to accelerate the blade through any guard position. And it's extremely easy to redirect. The scientific mass distribution is pretty much a signature of Angus trim swords. It has a very even degree of distal taper throughout the blade to offset the lack of profile taper. Now there's some narrowing on the upper portion, about top 1/3 of the blade. Still, to make a broad blade this lively and light is really a feat that can only be achieved by several makers. Throughout the medieval age, there has been a continued trend to optimize swords, even for the same purpose. And if you look at the Type X to Type XIIIb, we pretty much see the continuous purpose of being cut-centric. Now let's take a look at Oakshott Type XII arming sword, essentially a close cousin to the Type XIIIb sword. And you can see they are both cut-centric single-handed sword from around the same time. But if you compare their silhouette, the profile of the blades, there's no mistake which one is the more cut-focused sword. The Type XII has a more pronounced continuous profile taper, resulting in a more acute tip. Still, this is very much a cut-centric sword, though has some enhanced penetration against, textile protections like gambison. But with a tip like this on Type XIIIb blades, many of them have very rounded tip, almost spatulate, a very short arc transition to the tip. That tells you they are mostly used in tip cuts. So if you calculate the distance with your opponent, you can just have an impact using the tip of the sword to rake through the textile protection of your opponent and deeply wound the flesh underneath, which is pretty difficult to do if you do a head-on impact with the flat of the edge. You see, it doesn't really concentrate the force, especially given a profile, right? Doesn't have a lot of taper, so the edges are very much straight instead of being curved with more profile taper. But jamming the tip in a cutting motion is a great way to penetrate textile armor. Now, it might not have the enhanced thrusting potential, but still, this is not terrible if you only use it against closing. Let's look at the rigidity of the blade. Now, I can tell you, this blade is not very thick at the base, right? Just over 5 millimeters. And I'm obligated to keep a secret of the setting of the distal taper for Gus, but I can tell you it has a pretty even distal taper, continuously thinning down, reaching here. It's basically a sheet of paper. And you would think it's very flexible, but actually the width of the blade helps maintaining the rigidity a bit. So it's not really that floppy, although you can see there's some noticeable flexibility here. And if we compare to Type XII sword, the Albion Knight, you can see, yeah, it's fairly comparable. This one feels a little bit more rigid, but considering that this one weighs 6 ounces more than the Angus trim sword, even though it's about 1 inch longer in the blade, this feels very substantial, right, in the hand. Feels great. Has a very average weight for this type of sword of this size, and this just tells you design philosophy of Peter Johnson for the Albion next generation line of swords to have very medium weight to be perfectly representative of the type of sword they're trying to recreate. It feels pretty good, right? Solid feeling of this type. Yet Angus Trim pushes the limit to always find the most extreme example in terms of the lightweight and liveliness on the type of medieval sword he's trying to replicate. Now, some of the Type XIIIb swords are indeed very light and handy. Now, you can find heavier examples, of course, but usually they are cut-centric swords, so you really need to optimize the handling when you swing the sword, how quick the blade is, right? All these big cutting motions, you cannot afford to have very heavy and unwieldy swords when you have to hold it in one hand, probably guarding yourself with a shield in the offhand. Now, with this degree of rigidity, it's pretty reliable in cutting, and having such a flat and smooth grind of lenticular cross-section on the upper portion of the blade, wide but thin, resulting in very small edge angles, and makes it effortless to cut through, toughened gambison. And you can see the difference between the earlier Type X and the contemporary Type XIIIb sword is that it uses less steel, being a little bit narrower at the base, but still maintain this degree of broadness throughout. Yet, another defining feature of the Type XIIIb blade, especially versus the earlier Type X, is that it doesn't feature the broad and long fullers throughout. Instead, it has usually 1 or 2 fullers in the bottom half. And you can see here, on each side of this blade, there are 2 fullers, and terminating right before the midpoint of the blade. So, on the upper portion, it's a continuous, smooth lenticular cross-section. This pretty much improves the performance and handling of the sword. This Albion Reeve here, up to the point I purchased this Type XIIIb, had been my favorite arming sword in terms of handling. Just the liveliness, and it weighs only 2 pounds 5 ounces, whereas this one weighs even 3 ounces less, and their reach are almost identical. So it just speaks volume of this excellent design. How efficient it is with the use of steel. And fortunately, I got to cut some tatami mats when I visited Gus with sword friend Vic and Jon. This sword really sang when it went through the target, but it also just feels very intuitive. The moment you pick it up, you feel connected with the sword. When you visit Angus Trim and he lays out all of his work of different types, every single sword you pick up is like magic. But you feel nuance between different models when you compare them. Every one of them is your new favorite, but like Gus said, it's not really the quality of the sword, the handling characteristics alone. It's that how they can be connected with the swordsman, the wielder. And even though I like pretty much all of these swords Gus graciously presented to us, European Chinese Jian hybrid, the Type XVIII arming sword, Type XIIIb.4, all of these are, the pinnacle of sword handling, being extremely lightweight for their sizes, but also handles extremely well, pretty much like a dream for every one of them. The moment I picked this one up, it's like a combination of the geometry of the grip, but also the mass distribution along the blade. Just makes you feel it's yours. And it's a feeling difficult to explain. And I could immediately cut tatami mats really well with this sword. There's some calibration to be done, but pretty much after the first cut, I was just one with the sword. You really have to marvel at Angus Trim's understanding of not just swords, but also swordsmen. In his numerous posts, introducing his different models, he always recounts his intention of the purpose of the sword behind each design. But he also talks about other people's experience, different practitioners with certain renown in the competition cutting field, how they react and appreciate each of his models. He understands my preference perfectly. Some of Gus XIIIb blades have a flared shoulder here to aid with the mass distribution, and you can find this trait on some of the originals. Your Oakshot's personal collection, the Moon brand, so it's like a hybrid between XIIIb and 14, and each one of these has their own unique personalities.
So I am fortunate enough to own an Angus trim 13B. I specifically have the 13B.10, and this is a really good time to showcase the fact that how different yet very similar some of the different models that Mr. Trim makes. So we'll talk about aesthetics and all that a little bit later, but as you can see, the .3 has a longer blade, and they do handle quite a bit differently. Slightly longer blade length. You could feel it, like initially when picking it up. You could feel that there's more blade presence, which makes total sense. Aesthetically, though, they both rock double fullers, but they go about it quite differently. The .10 has them further out, or they're spread apart, and they're actually blackened. This one has much thinner looking fullers. Cross sections are a little bit different. Kane could touch on that here in a second. I actually like the 13B.10 a lot because it is so agile for its size. This I do like quite a bit, but it has a little bit more blade presence to it. But I think they're both tremendous swords, and it's really just about what feels better to you. What do you think, Kane?
Exactly.
This comparison between the two variants of Type XIIIb really illustrates how different properties cater to different users' preferences and habits. The 13B.10 has a blade 3 inches shorter and a weight about 2 ounces lighter. It has a more stout profile and a less extreme degree of distal taper, resulting in a more robust feeling, with the mass of the blade more concentrated in a more compact package. The blade is stabler and more rigid, being able to deal out damage with both cut and thrusts in a more reliable way. But it has 10% less reach, and being shorter, you can immediately feel there's less inertia on the upper portion of the blade that guides your hand, so it does less work for the user. Personally, I enjoy the longer yet still nimble sword, which helps the blade track and move better, even though it's still really easy to stop and redirect. This is mirrored by our choices of Angus trim falchion models. Like a Déjà Vu, I chose a longer, more flexible French medieval falchion, while Vic picked the shorter, stouter, and stabler F4C.1, further corroborating Gus' theory of no best swords, but only most attuned sword for a given swordsman. Now back to Vic's place. The ladies and us cut off a mountain of bottles, hundreds of them. Now, we use many performance cutters on that day, but this one particularly stood out.
Look at that.
Even the ladies, without a lot of cutting experience, still they could pick up this Type XIIIb sword by Angus trim and just do those trick cuts like false edge, double cuts.
Told ya. Super satisfying.
Coming around and then come back to slice another bottle.
Let's go.
Perfectly fine. If you look at Deborah's cut over here, you can see reverse edge cut on the way back. It was so clean that the bottle just stood there.
Wow! Holy moly!
Now, neither using false edge to cut or leaving the bottle standing like that is easy for anybody. I remember that Philip Martin once said that in order to cut with the false edge, especially with a one-handed sword, you really have to stabilize your hand, because if you meet any sort of resistance on the way passing the target, this could wrench the sword out of your hand very easily. See, the idea is on a true edge cut, should the edge meet any resistance, you have 4 fingers helping you lock the grip inside your hand. Conversely, on a false edge cut this way, you have the sword in an extended position and you rotate backward. Should the edge meet any resistance, you don't really have the 4 fingers helping you locking the grip in your hand, and all the grip has to do is to slip past the base of your thumb and you'll be disarmed. So Philip Martin recommend holding the sword with a finger above the guard to help secure the sword in false edge cuts, which is possible with this sword. Even though it doesn't have a recoil, it has a short blunted area at the base of the blade, so you can safely put your index finger, above the guard to loop around it. So it's still relatively comfortable, but you have two fingers sandwiching this crossguard, so any resistance wouldn't really have a chance for the grip to be wrenched out of your hand. So what does this tell us? Obviously, adding false edge cuts to your repertoire will make the fighting or cutting more dynamic and challenging, but there's always a difficulty to handle the sword correctly, transition from the conventional grip to the thumb grip. If you don't do it correctly, there's a risk that the cut will fail catastrophically, but you will also be disarmed. It also illustrates the difficulty of executing false edge cuts in test cutting scenarios. So going through a bottle so clearly demonstrates the cutting capacity of this Atrim sword.
Feeling ballsy.
Do it.
Oh, okay. That sounds like kind of windy today.
It is.
You got this. We have
Wow.
faith in you.
Thank you. Your faith is most appreciated. I'm gonna try and bring it
Yeah.
and then bring it back.
Yeah.
Maybe. Maybe.
We'll know what happened.
Wow!
Nice.
I did it.
Holy moly!
You did a false edge double cut. Good
Right.
job.
Wow.
I feel like a badass today. I'm fine going back to work tomorrow.
Oh, that's gonna be in the video. That's in the video. Nicely
Can
done.
you imagine that your minister was doing
I mean, I feel like all the Atrim swords make this easy though.
Right.
I feel confident in my abilities there. Are you coming down here now? Are you going to sacrifices? Good girl. Oh my goodness.
Let's go. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Hey.
It sings a little. Oh, it's an Atrim. That's fine.
Nice.
I like this.
Feel a much longer blade than mine.
Definitely. So it's got a little bit more energy out there.
Nice.
There you go.
Yeah, there's nothing about nothing like it, man.
Okay.
So this one, it's a little bit flexible. The upper portion is really thin or flat. So you would cut, ideally your land, this portion. Otherwise it will flex a little bit more.
Okay.
Maybe it'll.
There's a lap available.
It's so light.
That must be
So light.
So because it's so light,
I don't know if you know
need
this,
to
but she's
like
a
swing a
princess.
little bit
Well,
further,
I'm saying-
like give it a little bit more.
Give it a.
So
Okay.
yeah, it doesn't have the mass, so it's a speed cut.
Okay.
Throw it out there.
I am terrified.
Yes, you are.
Nice!
Hey!
It sings a little. Oh, it's an Atrim. That's why.
Nice. And a ring.
You sing.
Yeah.
Sings a song of death.
Pretty.
That's the one Kane just got from Angus Trim.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a good one.
Sweet.
I don't want to go too much on that. The top of the spikes right.
So as you can see, this sword cuts extremely well even when picked up by any arbitrary person the first time, but ultimately it's the combination of graceful handling and the overall aesthetics that does it for me. Its edges are honed, but could be sharper. I'll touch on that sharpness later. But suffice to say, I'm perfectly impressed by this acquisition, and the opportunity to meet with a legendary swordmaker with a number of sword friends is quite an experience in its own right. If you ever have the chance to visit Gus at the workshop and pick up a sword or two, seize it, because you won't regret it. He's such a gracious host and a knowledgeable person. You might get some secret discounts on selected pieces too. And where else do you ever get a chance to handle dozens of his different models and hear about the thoughts on the nuance behind each design? Maybe at a convention he goes to, such as Valley of the Sun, so-called sword fight. You know, during this visit, along with the interesting models that each handles like a dream in its own right, one particular model caught my eye. That is the discontinued Lady Ash, an old Type 17 longsword that's unimaginably lightweight, coming in at 2 pounds with a 36-inch long blade. It decidedly feels ethereal in the hand. But Gus explained that his intention behind this model is to design an ultra lightweight cutting longsword for female practitioners, yet still strong enough to endure all sorts of abuses when their idiot boyfriends pick it up to swing around with. Foreshadowing enough? Well, it certainly isn't an easy sword to cut with, even in the hand of the rightful owner. So that piqued my curiosity enough to get a permission from the lady to cut with it. Sure enough, the first cut with my regular output went about 90% through. So I get to reevaluate the strategy of using this sword and how the feather weight makes it incredibly easy to accelerate, but at the same time demands extra velocity to make up for the lack of mass. I calibrated my swings to give it a little bit more oomph, and it went through the mats like a laser, much to my surprise. It speaks volume of Gus' design of making swords not just generally easy to handle, but also intuitive for anyone to pick up and build a connection with after minimal calibration. But also, if you look at the first cut that I failed to run through completely, in slow-mo, clearly the blade can be seen bending about 90 degrees. You know, all that flex absorbed all the shock, so the blade didn't take a set, instead went back to true. This is a testament of the quality of heat treatment by Gus. Funny thing is that some time ago, a community poll was conducted on which discontinued models Gus should bring back. At the time, I was the only one who voted for Lady Ash due to the rare 17 type, but the impossibly lightweight too. Now I finally get to handle and even cut with it. Certainly was a wish fulfilled. But it also tells us, the caliber of Angus Trim's not just design, but the heat treatment, the use of steel. Now, we chat quite a bit about the challenges of heat treatment. Gus used to use heat treat center in Pacific Northwest. Their aerospace grade heat treatment center has been great for Gus for over a decade. Now, in the past few years, they switched to a new process, essentially lowering the cost for batch heat treatment. Angus trim was able to adapt to this process, have to wait a little bit longer. But the problem is that many came back warped. Got to the point that 90% of them were warped after the heat treatment, so he had to find alternatives. Lately, he had been able to use the heat treatment by another sword maker and had them pack up the blade and ship back. And this sword was heat treated that way. The heat treatment went really well. It's a new type of steel Angus trim uses, from some of the US-based suppliers. He suspects them to use foreign steels because there's a lack of consistency when you heat treat them. Many of the steel sword blades, because they are so thin and flat, right, they are prone to warpage after heat treatment. So once he found this new heat treatment routine with another maker, he was able to heat treat them with greater reliability. However, on their way to be shipped back with other swords in that batch, it was bundled in a way that's not great because you have to settle the blade after heat treatment for some days. And when they shipped back the blades to Angus trim, pretty much when they had to forego that process, and this blade came back warped a little bit. And Gus spent several weeks to correct this warp in the blade. In the end, he described this blade as being heartbreakingly close to completely straight. He used some grinding methods to get rid of the warpage. And when I looked down, just scoped down the edges, the blades, I could see almost no warping at all. Had he not told me about the warping, I would just assume that this blade is completely straight because it certainly feels like it and looks like it. But he showed me that on one side of the termination of the footer are asymmetric, not completely even, just a very minor flaw in order to correct the warpage in the blade. But this is so cosmetic, and most people wouldn't even notice this. And he was very honest with this and also gave me an extra discount for this sword. And I'm just perfectly happy with the way it is, the handling, but also the look. If you look at the lower half of the blade, he has a hexagonal cross section. There are two hard edges on the side flanking the bifilar. Just have this hexagonal cross section, and if you feel the edges, they're very flat, so a perfect flattened hexagonal cross section. But it transitions with grace to the lenticular cross section on the upper portion. So this blade has a lot of characteristics, unique traits of 13th and 14th century swords. And if you just compare these two blades, right, Type 14 arming sword of the Albion Sovereign and this Atrim Type XIIIb, you can see that this is the next step of the natural evolution. So essentially maintaining a lot of the cutting potential, but still have a lot of emphasis, of late to have a more acute point, to have a more balanced blade between cut and thrust. Yet this Type XIIIb arming sword just goes further down the rabbit hole of being cut-centric. You can look at the disparity of these two swords. How much broader this Type 14 blade is at the base, but on the upper portion, right, this Type XIIIb blade remains broader. Even though this is still quite broad for enhanced cutting, this blade is broad throughout, all the way up to the tip. So every part of this blade is very much optimized for cutting performance. In terms of handling, you'll think that this Albion Sovereign with so much more profile taper than the Type XIIIb by Angus trim, it should handle better in terms of rotation. Of course, this is going to be heavier, and it handles pretty well. But if I put it down for a second, oh, this is so much more effortless. Right? Still, you can feel the authority because the point of balance is at 4 3/4 inches from the guard. Gus like using these smaller wheel pommels to balance out the entire sword. And the quality of fit and finish is just on par with all Angus trim swords. And you can see the guard and pommel are heat blued to increase their resistance to rust, and has this very well-shaped single-handed grip. You know, it has a central swell in the thickness, the middle of the grip. It also has some tapering. I find that Angus trim sword grips are the ideal ones when it comes down to my handling preference. You know, it slims down a little bit when it joins the pommel and the guard, so it locks in your hand perfectly. But you can loosen them slightly and still have perfect control. There's not a lot of fear of the sword being disarmed, wrenched off of your hand. The thickness and width are just perfect for at least my hands. If you have the chance to handle numerous swords at Angus Trim's workshop, you get to see and feel the nuance of their grips. You know, there are subtle differences. You think that they all look very similar, which is true, but when you pick them up, some are more oblong in cross-section, so the sides are flatter. Well, this one is rather flat on the sides, give you very good edge alignment. But some of the grips for long swords made by Angus Trim, they have just pretty flat sides to give you a lot of edge alignment cue and aiding feel excellent. You are able to connect with the sword through this interface. And I also enjoy the color of the leather dye of the overwrap. Very dark oxblood with a hue between brown and purple. And also you can see the cord wrap is done very evenly. You know, the seam, it's just perfect. You cannot feel where it is. If you just turn it around, close your eyes, you cannot really tell where the seam is. It's just perfect. There's no hot spot anywhere on the grip. And this pommel is kind of different from the other ones on the Angus Trim swords I own up to this point. You see there's a central hub, very prominent. It has a concave grind to transition to that central hub. So it looks just great. However, when you handle the sword, you do feel the central hub, you know, on the side of your palm. It's not uncomfortable, it's just noticeable. And the pommel is also secured with a permanent nut that resembles a pin block. The gap to the crossguard fits the base of the blade really well. You can listen to the ringtone when you knock on the sword, or when it makes an impact with the target. It speaks volume about the caliber of heat treatment, how it's consistently and evenly done on the entire blade, but also the quality of the tight assembly of the hilt. The blade has a satin surface polish. It's done very evenly, and you can see how smooth and flat the surface is, basically without any replay. This is quite difficult to execute on one with two different cross sections, two fullers on each side, but also a great degree of distal taper. Now, Gus has asked me to not disclose the specifics of distal taper. So unlike my other reviews, Brother Kane has taken a vow of silence. Suffice to say, it has a large degree of distal taper and is distributed non-linearly. You can also see the chip here is very well formed, very true to Oakshott Type XIIIb. Has a very short transition to the point with a gracefully formed arc. Both the hexagonal and the lenticular cross-section culminates into a rather refined edge geometry. The primary bevel and the secondary bevel are blended in. There's no hard transition, even though you can see the difference in the polish. And I can tell you the section near the edge is quite thin. About the quality of the apexing is on par with the sharpness provided by other premium makers, such as Albion, Lockwood, Valiant Armory, or European Smiths, which is enough to cut out of the box, but not going to make up for the absence of some techniques and good edge alignment. Gus told me the edges are stropped, and I can clearly tell through fingernail tests that the edges are very clean without any debris. I can definitely see the edges honed up a little bit more before being taken to a cutting competition. With a workshop, it shouldn't take more than 3 to 5 minutes. You can tell how happy I am with this sword, especially now I'm finally able to complete my Oakshott collection. and I was not only able to acquire this excellent piece, but also having opportunity to chat personally with Angus Trim, talking about the challenges in the heat treatment and the steel acquisition in recent years, some of the difficulties he has met personally with sword making, the nuance in handling of various antique medieval swords, European swords, but also Chinese jian. If you don't know, Gus Trim is also a practitioner of Type XIII. So he has a lot of experience using Chinese jian. We talk about the kind of mass distribution on Chinese double-edged swords and how the antiques have very uniform, good degree of distal taper, but also the rate of thinning down is very even throughout the blade. Almost like made with modern machinery, but they were made centuries ago. So it's just a testament of how people in the past were able to dedicate their time to the craftsmanship and the understanding of swords, and how Gus was inspired to create some of his own Chinese jian takes with European sword hilts. He also shared some of these findings in examining originals fittings on Chinese jian, that they have hollow, usually perforated guard and pommels, and that changes the dynamics of sword handling. He also talked about lots of other topics such as competition cutting in HEMA, but also his own novel writing. If you don't know, Angus Trim is a published author, and his latest work, the XIIIb saga, telling the story of post-apocalyptic dystopian society set in Pacific Northwest. And he also incorporated many of his sword-making knowledge into the novels, as the novels are set 200 years in the future when the society collapsed and the capacity of manufacturing firearms, ammo, maintaining them have been greatly diminished. So humans have to go back to more primitive weapons like hand-powered melee weapons. So his knowledge of sword making, but sword usage come into play, and I think that's greatly appreciated. At XIIIb Sword Reviews, Jon talked about his latest acquisition of the medieval tactical sword by Angus Trim and how he loved it. That model will fit perfectly into the XIIIb saga by Angus Trim. So check out this series of novels on Amazon. I had so much fun this past weekend being able to meet up with my sword friends, peers in sword reviewing, but also this legendary figure in sword making. Stay tuned for my upcoming reviews and videos, many in collaboration with Vic and Jon at XIIIb Sword Reviews. An alternative version of this review will be featured on XIIIb Sword Reviews with Vic and Jon's unique personal takes on this sword. Check that out, and some of the other footage of sword cutting carnage we have done at his place. Link in the description below. Until then, please like and subscribe.